Okay, hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk about arts-based learning through a critical aesthetics of care. Starting off with a quote from the artist Agnes Denis. All my work is about doing something for humanity. It's not just philosophy and visual beauty, it's about dealing with problems humanity has and trying to find benign solutions. Starting with examples of environmental artists that are inspiring me in terms of how I might teach sustainability in an arts-based way. Here we have Mel Chin. This is a remediation project he did using plants to try to accumulate heavy metals from contaminated soil in order to remediate it. This is Agnes Denis, we saw before in that quote. This is a project called Wheatfield, where she planted a wheat field in the middle of New York City in the early 80s, creating these kind of surreal images, commenting on urban land usage. And this is a piece called Tree Mountain, creating a man-made mountain that is meant to, these trees are meant to grow over the next 400 years, and they are planted in this very specific mathematical spiral pattern. So it is a time capsule for the future, commentary on old growth forest and our interventions in nature. This is Anna Mendieta, Cuban-American artist, and ecofeminist who uses her own body in a lot of her sculptural works. A lot of works using animal blood, commenting on violence against women and its connection to the environment. And this is Mary Mattingly, who does this very speculative work. This is a piece called Wearable Homes. She does a lot of pieces accumulating the kinds of objects that she lives with and creating these visuals with them, and a lot of pieces on barges in water, kind of appealing to maritime law to create these floating habitats and food forests and sort of sustainable, self-sustaining systems. And so what are some common elements we see in these contemporary environmental artists? One, they use living material. Two, they're often interdisciplinary. Three, they're very socially engaged. And four, they're more focused on the process of the art rather than creating a product. This is art outside of the gallery or the publication. And in terms of how they engage, there's these two dimensions. The critical dimension, critiquing what is, pointing out problems, and the speculative dimension, imagining possible futures, both of which are really important when it comes to the climate issue. Here's Mel Chin talking about sculpting the land and carving the pollution out of the earth. And the need to create the tools to do so. So using arts as a basis to kind of think about problem solving, but not in the instrumentalist way we do when we think about environmental science. And that's the next section here, is the interdisciplinary dimension. What can arts teach us about scientific problems and social problems? Well, here's some things the research tells us: that we can use arts-based learning to engage students in controversial issues in science, that we can use it to shift away from instrumentalist and positivist paradigms, and that we can perhaps even cultivate a common world understanding, so a sense of living with the world rather than treating the world as an object, as we sometimes tend to do when we have a reductionistic kind of approach to scientific problems. And that brings me into what I'm calling the critical aesthetics of care. So drawing off of Afifi's article, Afifi talks about the need to strike a balance between climate despair on the one hand and a sort of false optimism or blind hope on the other. And he thinks we can do this using aesthetics as a starting point, looking at the beauty we find in the darkness of the climate problem, seeing a vulnerable life system and cultivating a sense of care for that system, being outside of our selfish interests and being a part of that whole. Here's a quote from him talking about how this sense of vulnerability decenters us, right? Removes us from ourself to be a part of that whole and to want to care for the self and the other at once, right? That we all sort of become part of this one life system. And I think that that is very important in combating climate despair and climate ignorance. So project-based learning. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here. There's a lot of material out there on PBL that our cohort has learned in other courses. But I think that using this, everything that I've talked about up till now, we could plan a really good project-based unit encouraging students to explore environmental art using this kind of framework, right? This could happen in an arts class or in a science class or in a challenge and change class, a whole lot of different starting points here. And we often think of these kinds of units as going from general to specific in terms of student skills and student content knowledge. But I think what's also important to emphasize here is going from general to specific in terms of the affective dimension, the emotional dimension. Students are already aware of climate issues and are often overwhelmed by them. But by giving them a project that doesn't have a instrumental outcome that may be beyond the scope of a high school student, but allows them to still engage to some degree with scientific issues like how Mel Chin does, that allows them to do this interdisciplinary work in a communal kind of experiential way, they can cultivate some sense of control over the problem, some sense of self, and also being outside the self and being with the world around them, the community, their locality. And so I think if students engaged in projects similar to the examples we saw, they could end up cultivating this sense of care that Afifi talks about, which I also think lends itself towards what Oyala called that critical emotional awareness that is so important for dealing with our own reactions to the climate crisis. So that's about all the time I have, but that is how the research has inspired my thinking about arts-based learning and interdisciplinary learning. Here are my references, and here are my image credits. Thank you all for listening.